this is Roger, thanks for dropping by. Have to put up with Scruffy today, no shave, but I did put a clean shirt on, I think. Yes, I did. I'm not in a smart mood, basically, as in smart dress. Right, news. Mum's very poorly. They can't do a pacemaker until sometime next week. They've had trouble getting veins. According to my sister, her arms are black and blue where they just can't find a vein. But when my sister went in, they hadn't had the results of the blood test back. And until they get them, nothing happens, basically. She's on oxygen and a drip. My sister gave her a right mouthful on the grounds that she doesn't like hospital food. Well, don't eat and die then, stupid. So she's had a good talking to. My mum is a stubborn person. If you tell her to do something, she won't do it deliberately. She's stubborn like that. So my sister was the one to go and see, because I'd just get cross and walk out. Whereas my sister will persevere, shall we say. And you don't want to be on the wrong end of my sister's perseverance, trust me. So that's the state of play with Mum. They're not doing anything about the pacemaker until into next week. They obviously won't move till they've got blood tests, and they might need to do more. And she's in a very weak state on the ground she won't eat, and probably isn't drinking anywhere near enough anyway. I said to my sister, well, at least she's in a nice air-conditioned place. Apparently not. I couldn't believe that. Yeah, she said it was like an oven in the hospital. Well, that's not conducive to getting well, is it? When you're using up your energy, you know, that way round. Anyway, so that's mum news. What else? Diet news. I've just literally come back from the shops, or the little shop round the corner, which has a free-from shelf. It's all bitty one in the corner, which you have to find and then have a look and think, is that it? Well, apparently that is it in a small shop like that. Fair enough. At the large 24-hour supermarket that I get my home shop from, the range is quite extensive. But I did notice that 3/4 of the range is sugary stuff. Biscuits, chocolates, cakes, all the sort of stuff you shouldn't be flipping eating anyway. So that left not too much. But anyway, round the corner shop today, I got a loaf. It's called a triple seeded farmhouse loaf. It's got lots of natural seeds in it. It's gluten-free, and it's got a reasonable amount of fibre and all those things like the things that make your cat's coat shiny. All that sort of, you know, stuff. So it sounds like it's got most of what you would normally get, apart from the gluten. And it made, the toast wasn't bad. It got to the point this morning where I thought, I've actually got nothing to eat if I'm going to stick to this. I have nothing to eat. You've got to have some food. So I had to go shopping. And I got a few sort of nutty bars and things like that for snacking, in case I do get hungry. But now I've got a loaf. I've always got the slice of toast option, or have an egg on toast, something like that. So we should be okay. Whether it's going to make any difference, well, I'm not going to tell in a couple of days, am I? So that's a longer term project to actually find out if it's doing any good. And if it isn't doing any good and nothing changes, then that wasn't the problem anyway. However, what my son said was the bread that I was making and the fact that it contributed to a fair percentage of my diet, my overall food intake per day, he said that is just too much for anybody to put up with. You need to cut that gluten down, because it's not a natural thing to be taking on board. It's difficult to explain, but if you find wild wheat, it's a wispy little thing with a few grains on the top, and there wouldn't be much gluten in that, and it would make crappy bread, basically. We've bred wheat to be like it is now, bursting with huge big grains and everything like that, so the gluten content's gone through the roof. Most people tolerate it fine. Some people possibly don't tolerate it very well, but don't know that they don't. They just put up with what would be relatively minor symptoms. But you know, grains are a natural part of our diet, but not necessarily all one type, which is what you tend to get in bread, isn't it? I mean, I just had a look at the breakfast cereal that I've stopped eating. It's made from whole grain wheat. 96% of that product is whole grain wheat. Well, how much gluten's there going to be in that breakfast cereal? Okay, there's next to no sugar and all the other nasty things, but so you can see my gluten intake was suddenly dramatically increased with the strong flour, extra strong wholemeal flour. You get the goodness of the wholemeal and whack up the flipping gluten. So anyway, we will try. It's not going to be totally gluten-free. I'm not going to be stupid. I mean, my Sunday meal is like a pretend roast. I don't do a roast, but I have a steak or a nice pork chop or something. But I do all the vegetables and have some gravy. Well, the gravy has got wheat flour in it as a thickener. Well, how much of a percentage of that gravy is going to be the wheat flour, and then how much of that is gluten? It's negligible. So I'm not intolerant, I'm what's called sensitive. I have a sensitivity to gluten, allegedly. We haven't proved this yet, don't forget. So anyway, I have food in the house because it was getting a bit silly. Yeah. I mean, I had scrambled eggs for breakfast, and it seemed really weird having scrambled eggs on a plate without a piece of toast underneath them because I didn't have any bread. Oh. Anyway, so we've got some food in the house now. And most of my meals don't change. You know, things like my curry, there'll be a bit of wheat flour in the sauce possibly, but not a huge amount. My chilli, beans, good for you, all stuff like that, you know, and I suspect there'll be a bit of wheat flour in the sauce to thicken it. But apart from that, it's natural ingredients, rice, vegetables, very lean meats, fish. So most of my diet just stays exactly the same. The big deal was obviously the bread, and we just chop that and replace it with a substitute. Job done. And not worry myself to death about trying to remove gluten completely, because that just starts getting silly. I can remember when my son, he was intolerant. He had severe reactions for even small amounts. And you try doing Christmas for 2 normal people and 1 that has to be gluten-free. It started getting really difficult. He was also vegetarian at the same time, so that cut the meat out. So I said, what are you going to have for Christmas dinner then? A plate full of vegetables and no gravy? Gets difficult. Anyway, so that's all that cobblers. I'm going to have a chat about feed and feeding. So if you don't like people talking about that sort of thing, you can shut down now. You'll miss the joke at the end. I've got one ready. It ought to be a Christmas joke really, but it'll do in the middle of the year. Right, so first of all, feeding levels. This is overall feeding levels, and I do parts per million. I don't do microsiemens, and it seems that almost everybody does parts per million, apart from serious growers in the UK orchid societies. And it's like in the States, they think, you know, pints and ounces and all that sort of stuff is normal. No, it's not. You're the exception, sunshine. The rest of the world is metric. You're the odd one out. And these guys in the orchid societies, they think they're normal. Well, I've never heard of anybody using parts per million. They don't get out much. That's the problem. So I'm sticking with that because that's what most people, certainly in the YouTube world, understand. Parts per million. And most people will use a standard TDS meter to measure it. Total dissolved stuff. TDS. Don't need flashy names for this. Right, so overall level. So this is the total parts per million. My mounts normally around 180, 200. Because they get fed very frequently, I don't need to take that up high. I'm not one of these that feeds once a fortnight and then flushes for the rest of the time. This is growing season, and that's what I'm talking about. And it changes throughout the year. But now, in the growing season, mount's about 180, possibly 200, and that's total. That won't be all necessarily MSU, which is my stable fertilizer. It might not be all that. It might be MSU and something else, but I don't go over those top levels. So if I'm going to put an additive, a supplement in with my MSU, there will be less MSU. So the parts per million will probably come down to about 140, 150, so that I can then take it up to 180 with the supplement. So I don't have the supplement in on top. We'll talk about what they are in a minute. So that's my overall level for my mounts. And you have to bear in mind they get fed twice and flushed once. Well, in warm weather, that's 3 days worth of feeding. What about my pots? They get watered every 4 or 5 days. If I apply the same logic to them, how often are they going to get flushed? Once every quite a long time. So with my pots, I work a different way. I feed at a slightly higher level, aiming up around 250 parts per million, but I do one feed, one flush this time of year. Yeah? So I shouldn't be getting any build up whatsoever, and I give a chance for the media to just get a wash through, basically. So nothing's accumulating. That's the theory. Right, so that's it, mounts and pots. My cooler, shadier stuff, as I call it, Masdevallias, Restrepias, stuff like that, they get fed once and flushed twice or even 3 times. And they get fed at around 100 parts per million, sometimes less. Sometimes only 80. They don't get much food at all. They don't quite honestly need it. And a lot of those sort of orchids have got pretty sensitive roots as well. They're not big strapping sturdy roots like on Cattleyas and Vandas and things like that. Some of them are pretty sensitive, and you overfeed, you will damage your roots, you'll burn them. So you start getting brown stains all over them and pitting and things like that. They're burn marks mainly, can be other things. So that's my levels at this time of year, growing season, and frequency, roughly. That frequency varies considerably. We had hardly any sun yesterday. It's drizzling out there at the moment. I mean, Elvis went missing sometime Friday night. He came back sometime last night. He wasn't back before I went to bed. Thunder and lightning Friday night, he bolted. And then wherever he went, he had to find his way back from. So he's been missing a day and a half at least. He's asleep on my chair at the moment, so he's had a good feed and none the worse for wear. But it depends where he is, because I've seen it. At the sound of thunder, he will often retreat to the hallway in a dark corner. Well, that's fine if the lightning's out the back of the house, because he's the other end of the kitchen and in the hallway. He's still potentially in the dark. But if the lightning's at the front of the house, it's going to light the whole hall up. And how is he going to run away from it? He's going to bolt out the cat flap. So it depends what happens and when and where he is, and it depends whether I'm downstairs. Because if I'm downstairs, he tends to cower somewhere near me, sometimes on me. That's really funny. If he's sat on your lap and there's a clap of thunder, the first thing he does is to grab hold. Well, that's your leg. You got 5 holes in your leg now. Anyway, he's back now. Mojo was up on the bed because it woke me up, and he was on the bed and he looked up and then put his head down again. Now, he used to be petrified. He just seems, either he's gone deaf or he's got used to it. He might have gone deaf, I don't know. Then he wouldn't hear me calling or talking to him. So anyway, that's that. Back to the feed. Stable feed for me is the MSU formula. It read well, and then having read up on why that formula was sort of created and how, and the tests that were done, I thought, well, that's pretty good stuff. That's better than a lot of other stuff like the garden fertilizers, which have just copied that one over there and done no research whatsoever. So I thought, yeah, there's some work been done on this. This don't sound bad. And then I read up on the ingredients, shall we say, the elements, what they're for, and more importantly for me, how they interact with each other, because one on its own is often no good. And sometimes it's 2 or 3 together that actually make a function. So that it got complicated, but I stuck at it. And then I came back to the formula and I thought, that's pretty good stuff. Combining everything else I've read, the balance between the nitrogen, you've got your NPK, the balance between the N and the K is quite important. The P in the middle, they decided orchids don't use so much of that, anywhere near as much as they once thought, so they dropped it down. If they were all the same, it's not the end of the world. If you've got an N that's much higher than the other two, you need calcium as well, because you're going to generate green growth. And if ever of you have ever planted seeds in a tray and put them on your windowsill and they come out the soil and go whoosh, and they're all bent over towards the light and they're all wispy and spindly, whereas those sort of grown outside in a sort of shady place will be sturdy and strong. That's the difference between nitrogen having some calcium. I know that was a light, but that was for example. That was the light that did that, not the feed. But that's the effect you get with nitrogen. You get a lot of green growth, and without the calcium to back it up, it can be a bit flip-floppy. So like oncidium leaves will start pushing up there and then they'll bend halfway through and you've got a kink in them. Yeah, and they might even bend near the base, even worse. Yeah, Cattleya pseudobulbs push up like that and then the leaf flops over and doesn't stand up nicely. That's lack of calcium. Is it? Not necessarily. What it could be is a much higher percentage of nitrogen without the calcium backup. And it's these relationships that get forgotten about. If your N is higher than your K, you are pushing a plant into growth and encouraging it in growth mode. Now if it's sitting there doing absolutely nothing, you're wasting your flipping time, aren't you? What's it going to do with that nitrogen if it's not growing anything? It's wasted, yeah? So it'd be much better to have the N and the K balanced, close together is what I mean by balanced. They don't have to be identical, but close together. And again, the P is not quite so important. Now some people will vary that. Some people say, oh, in the autumn I like to have a high K value because it helps harden my plants off. Well, in the outside world, yes, it probably does. In a grow space, what are you trying to harden them off for? Are you going to suddenly introduce a frost into your greenhouse, are you, for your cattleyas? Think it through, yeah? So, and what most of the fertilizers that you buy that are that way inclined, they're not really a high K value, they're a low N value. So all they've done is dropped the nitrogen off, which doesn't then promote growth, and your K value does help with disease resistance and hardiness, ready for the winter. So outside does a world of good, not necessarily in your grow room. If you think about it, your orchids, you're not going to go round with a fertilizer for each one, a different mix for each plant. If you've got 200 plants, you might go round and water half of them today. Well, they're all going to get the same, aren't they? Are they all going to be growing like mad? No. Some are, some aren't. They still get the same. Well, they do in my place. I'm not going round with loads of different feeds and trying to remember which one needs what. Can't be bothered. They don't get that much anyway compared with some. I mean, I know a guy feeds his cattleyas hard. Okay, he uses microsiemens, but 600 to 700 microsiemens is 450 odd parts per million, and regular when they're in growth mode. But he does do it at plant level. So he's got all his cattleyas that are growing pseudobulbs and new root systems. They'll get one lot of feed. Those that have matured their growths will get a different feed. So he does do it like that. And then he grows spectacular cattleyas, so his bother is rewarded. My bother might not be rewarded quite so well, because I can't be bothered, that is. And then the other relationship, which I think is probably as important as talking about the NPK, is the calcium and the magnesium. And with the MSU formula, there are some plants where the calcium won't be enough when they're in active growth, because they're what's called a calcium hog. How do you find out which ones those are? It's called trial and error, because you won't find much of that documented. But anyway, a calcium value of around half of the nitrogen value is not a bad area to aim at. So if your fertilizer hasn't got any calcium in it, and you're not using tap water, which has got some calcium in it, not that it's the right sort, but yeah, so aim for a calcium value of about half of the nitrogen value-ish. Doesn't have to be exact. And then within that, the relationship between calcium and magnesium is more important than the relationship between magnesium and anything else. Yeah? Because if they get out of balance, you'll start getting lockout. So don't start whacking the magnesium up too high compared with the amount of calcium you've got. There is a relationship there, and magnesium of around half the calcium value is probably about as much as you should go. And a third, even down to a quarter of the calcium value is okay. That should be enough. Magnesium needs to be there for the photosynthesis and stuff like that. You can't just do without that. It has to be there. And remember that your calcium is immobile, comes in through the roots, heads off to where it's wanted, and that's where it stays. Even if suddenly it's wanted somewhere else, nope, tough. You decided you wanted it there, mate. That's where it's going to stay. Whereas your magnesium, they say, oh, we could do with more magnesium over here at the moment. Oh, I'll drag some over then. Well, then you've possibly got an area of the plant that hasn't got enough if you don't keep it topped up. So now magnesium sulfate, Epsom salts, is what a lot of people would be using. Take care, because it doesn't mix well with some of the other elements in your fertilizer, and often the reason is it's because it's not totally dissolved. Now, you might think it is, but it isn't. So it needs to be fully dissolved. And quite honestly, if you think your plants have a magnesium deficiency, well, first of all, ask yourself why. Why is it happening? What's my normal feed? What's wrong with my normal feed that I have to keep chucking in Epsom salts? You shouldn't need to. It doesn't rain Epsom salts out in the wild, does it? Doesn't rain calcium nitrate either, but you know what I mean. You shouldn't need to keep whacking up your magnesium value, providing you thought it was there in the first place. Now, if you're using a garden type fertilizer, it probably hasn't got calcium or magnesium, because they're expecting you to use it with tap water where there would normally be some. If you're not using tap water, if you're using rainwater or RO water or distilled water, you haven't got any calcium or magnesium. You've got to put some in. And I mean, I think that, you know, if say you had a nitrogen value of 16, then a calcium value of 8 would be pretty good, and a magnesium value of 4 would be a bit high. 3 would probably be a bit more sensible. 2 would still be okay. That sort of relationship. If the magnesium value starts to creep up towards the calcium value, you will start getting problems with this lockout procedure, where one interacts with another and stops it working. That's what lockout really means. That's pretty complicated, the lockout stuff. You start reading up on that. You bump up one and you mess up two. You know, it can get really strange. That's why I quite like the MSU, because it's reasonably balanced. Nothing can go dramatically wrong with that formula. But you will get plants that need a bit more of one thing that hasn't got. Like a really, really vigorous plant, there's probably not enough nitrogen in there. And if you start adding nitrogen into the MSU formula without the calcium, you'll get floppy growth. So you need both. If you want both, calcium nitrate. Cheap, cheerful, easy obtainable. Keep your tub done up tight. keep the moisture out of it. Usually comes in like little flakes. And the easiest way to find out how much you need is mix up your normal feed yeah, with your normal parts per million, or perhaps aim a bit lower for this experiment, and get a pinch of it and stick a pinch in and measure it again and see how much it's gone up by. And that's an imperial pinch, or was it a metric pinch? Or was it a big clumsy fingers pinch, or a little delicate fingers pinch? Pinch is a stupid measurement, isn't it? But you know how big your pinch is, yeah? And it might need 2 of yours, or it might need less than a big one like you just put in, but you find out quite easily, and then all you just do is remember it. You have to measure it each time, do you? I do, but you don't have to, you know. With the Epsom salts, I don't use it anymore. I have not found a distinct need. I can't see where anything is showing signs of a deficiency that would need it added in. But I wonder why that is when other people do. I use CalMag. Why do I use the CalMag? Because I want the extra calcium. I get the extra magnesium as a matter of course. And the CalMag that I use has got a nice relationship between those 2 elements, and it's also got some iron in a form that's readily absorbed, so it gives a little boost to that as well. There's a little bit of nitrogen in there as well, not a lot. So CalMag is quite a good way of adding in some extra calcium, because you bump up the magnesium as well, and the iron interacts with some other elements if you start increasing those 2. So that works quite well. And you don't need to know any of that. All you need to know is what's in your fertilizer that you use. Is everything that's supposed to be in there? And if not, get it from somewhere else. Or get a different fertilizer that's got it all in. And that really is, to me, the bottom line. If you've got a fertilizer that's got all of those elements in it, which is your 3 biggies, your NPK, and then your next 2, your calcium and your magnesium, some people stick sulfur in with those 2. I'm not so keen on that. Sulfur can have a burning effect, and I've never seen any fertilizer anywhere except one, and I'm not going to have a go, but I've only ever seen one fertilizer that's got a high sulfur value, and I personally had trouble with that on a few plants, not many. If you use a certain fertilizer and you look at the analysis of it and you can see a very high sulfur value, you and me are probably looking at the same one, or talking about the same one. And I did use it, you know, and it was pretty good. Most of the time it was fine. It was a good balance. I was a little dubious about that high sulfur value. Now, in amongst your elements, there are different things you can use for like your calcium. If you look at different fertilizers, they might be using different types or sources of calcium. Well, wherever you see the word sulfate, there's some sulfur in there, and that's the majority of where the sulfur comes from in your fertilizer, and it's often not directly actually attributed. On the list it's missing, and that's because it's implied, yeah, because sulfates have been used. That's where the name comes from. So anyway, bottom line, get a fertilizer that's got everything in it, or you will need more than one. So if your one has got everything in it apart from calcium, magnesium, get some CalMag. Oh, how much am I going to use? Well, you can sit down with a calculator and work it out if you want. I wouldn't. If I was in that position, yeah, and that calcium magnesium was expected to be in my tap water, which I'm not using because it's Orchids, then my CalMag would need to go in with my MSU. And if I wanted a parts per million of 200, I would aim around 150, 160, and then add the CalMag to take it up to 200. And I'd be happy with that. But I would get a calculator out and think, well, if this CalMag has got that percentage of calcium in it, and I'd try and work out roughly the percentage of parts per million I need to increase it to get a balanced calcium and magnesium. But I'd only ever do it once, and then I'd work on that. But, my calcium nitrate, I do the same thing. I wouldn't dream of using CalMag and calcium nitrate. That would be a bit OTT and probably pointless. So I'd do the same thing. I'd stick my, if I wanted 200 parts per million, I'd aim at about 150, and then I'd put the calcium nitrate in on top to get it up to around 200. So that would give that percentage. I've taken a third of the parts per million of my MSU and bumped that amount of calcium nitrate on top. Yeah? So overall it makes up a quarter, increase, but you see what I mean, it's a third. 50 parts per million as a percentage of 150 is a third, yeah? So then you have to sort of think about, well, given that there was some calcium already in there and some nitrogen already in there, that's bumped that up a fair bit. So we don't do that often. We don't do that every flipping feed. That's far too much. You don't need it. Not the type of orchids I'm growing anyway. Cymbidiums in growth mode might utilise that, but most of my orchids aren't putting enough growth on to use it up, so I wouldn't do it. Stopped using Epsom salts, basically because I don't see the need. If I see the need, I've got it, if I need it. And the only other thing I use, and that is occasionally, is the seaweed extract, the kelp type stuff. And I don't use that in any shape or form as anything remotely related to feeding, because it's not a fertilizer. It has some elements in it that can be utilised by the plant, but the most important things it's got in it are hormone type items that trigger things in plants, like they trigger root growth. They can bring things back into growth, those sorts of things. And if you put too much in, you can trigger the wrong sort of growth. Or you'll trigger growth over and above what the plant is capable of supporting, given the rest of what you're doing. So don't go mad. And if you overcook those elements in a plant, you will start getting things in the plant's metabolism going wrong. You'll start getting blooms that come out all bent and twisted, because you forced things into growing faster than they should. So a little, and I won't say a little and often, I'll just say a little. And I put seaweed in with my mix at about 20 parts per million, 30 at the most, about once every 3 weeks or a month. So they get a little bit of that, now and again, not much. And that's all I use nowadays. I've got my MSU, staple diet, my CalMag, which gets used this time of year reasonably frequently, and I've told you the sort of relationship between the parts per million. And then every now and again I'll change the CalMag to the calcium nitrate, and every now and again there will be some seaweed. If I'm going to add seaweed in, I only ever add it in with my MSU. I don't put it in on top of another supplement. And that's true with all my supplements. I only ever use one at a time and never put more than one in at once. So it's either CalMag or calcium nitrate or seaweed. And if it's none of those three, then it's just my staple diet fertilizer, which is at least every other one, every other watering. Yeah, so those supplements don't go in that often. You get into the winter, I hardly ever use them. Nothing much is growing. A lot of things will have stopped because of the short days, lower temperatures. No point chucking loads of feed in if they're not going to use it. Right, so that's my take on feed for now, and I hope I didn't do anything in there that I believe should be complicated, on the grounds that most people know what the NPK is. It's written on all fertilisers. In the UK it's law. If you're going to call it a fertiliser and it's got those three elements in it, you've got to say not only their percentage but what they're made of. And I'll come back to one point which has probably been said many times before. Check your nitrogen type. And what you want is nitrate nitrogen. and the more of that as a percentage, because you'll often have nitrate and ammonia type, or you might have ammonia type and urea. Ooh, not good for orchids. Not good for orchids. Urea nitrogen is cheap and cheerful and is great for chucking on the ground to feed things outdoors. Works wonders. Most of the farms are chucking it all over the place and leaking it all into our streams and killing the fish. So that's not good for orchids because it needs a process to break it down into a form that orchids can then use. So that's not good because we don't tend to grow in a media that would have the environment for that process to take place. Ammonia type can be used with a bit of help, but if you go for nitrate type nitrogen, it's readily available for the plant straight away. As soon as it's dissolved in water, it's up and running. It doesn't need any mucking about. It doesn't need microbes or chemical processes or any of that. It just goes straight in. So the type of nitrogen is important. All the other elements really, their source is far, far less important except one, calcium. Calcium carbonate, which is the stuff you get mainly in tap water, furs up your kettle, messes up your pipes, blocks up your central heating system. That's not readily available for plants. It has to have a process applied to it, which happens in soil. Yeah, so chucking your tap water on your plants outside, it's probably going to work fine. They will get the appropriate calcium. But we don't grow in soil, so we don't have the process. So calcium carbonate may be in your tap water, and you might think, oh, there's plenty of calcium in that. It furs up my kettle. Yeah, it's not going to do your plants any good. So yeah, the nitrogen type and the calcium type are the only two that you really need to look into to make sure they are of the right type or the best type. That's about it really. I mean, I know somebody who grows hundreds of Masdevallias, and if you ask him, what do you feed your Masdevallias on? Feed? Oh, I can't remember the last time I fed them. They still grow okay. So they must be breaking down some of the media in some shape or form. They must be getting some nutrients from somewhere. You know, they can't live on air. Right, so that'll do. I don't mind questions around that subject, and I don't mind comments around that subject, and I don't mind differing views. I still say that if you gather a hall full, a conference full of orchid growers and ask them how they feed their orchids, when they feed their orchids, and what with, you will get a different answer from every single one. So there is no right way, there is no one way, but what there is better ways than others. And as long as your way is good enough, then it's good enough. And if you don't want the headache and the 3 aspirin job every time you think about feeding your orchids, then don't worry about it. Just get a fertilizer that sounds okay. It sounds like all the bits are in there. Well, the list is really long, so it must be okay. And make sure those 5 biggies are there in reasonable proportions. The N and the K roughly the same. The P can drop down a bit to about half or even less, but it needs to be there. Don't get rid of it. And then calcium about half the nitrogen or a bit less, and magnesium about 1/3 to 1/4 of that. And then all the other elements are micro elements. You know, they're in 0.0 something or 0. Something. They're tiny, but they have to be there. Yeah? And I don't even attempt to remember what they are, because I know they're in mine. So why do I need to remember it? They're just there, which is why I chose it. So that's that. Most people will have glazed over, I'm sure, but that's my take on it. Everybody will have different ideas and everybody will do things differently. I mean, there's quite a good school of thought that says supplements should go in on their own and not with fertilizer. So if you're going to use calcium nitrate, use it on its own. If you're going to use Epsom salts, use it on its own. That one I'd agree with. You know, if you're going to use CalMeg, use it on its own. That's a way of doing it. Yeah? So I like to bump. Well, I always think of my supplements as bumping up some elements, giving some elements a bit of a boost. Well, if they go in on their own, you're not boosting anything, are you? Because there isn't anything else in there to go with. You're giving them a supplement on their own. That can have a different effect. Like I said, there's an interaction with these elements, and this one has an effect on those two, and that one of those two has an effect on this one over here, and that effect can only take place if this is going on. It's very, very complicated. And if you like that sort of thing, then read up on it. You'll find it fascinating. I don't. I have read up on it. I don't find it fascinating. All I wanted to do was find out if there was a bit missing, you know, and the bit missing was why I'd bothered to worry about it. Right, so that's that. That'll do for today. How long have we been going on? Oh, plenty long enough. Right, joke to end on. As I said, this ought to be a Christmas joke, but I found it comical because of what I do, you know, things that I do and get involved with, so I found it quite comical. I got a Microsoft Advent calendar, but unfortunately once you get a few windows open, they all shut down automatically and you can't open them again. See you next time.